This is Jeff Rogers with Channel 6 Central Kentucky Television, and our guest today is Scott Klinger. Mr. Klinger has recently written an article about the U.S. Postal Service and how it is facing potential financial collapse and how that bankruptcy could impact rural America. Mr. Klinger is a senior equitable development specialist with Jobs with Justice and is also an associate fellow with the Institute for Policy Studies. Welcome, Mr. Klinger. We're glad to have you with us at Channel 6 today.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this important topic.
So my first question is, I think it's fair to say that most Americans are familiar with the U.S. Postal Service, but they may not know the history and the mandate of the Postal Service. I wonder, could you give us a little context about how the Postal Service works in this country?
Sure. The Postal Service is one of our oldest public institutions. It was actually formed a year before the Declaration of Independence was signed. And it was never conceived of as being a moneymaker or to be run like a corporation. Its mission is to bring the American public together, both politically and economically. The early founders thought it was important to have magazines and periodicals delivered so that people could get a range of political thought of the day. And so those were delivered at a subsidized rate. The first roads in colonial America, New England, often are called post roads, and that's because they were built to serve postal routes. As the post office went on, everyone knows the story of the Pony Express, which was to connect the East and the West. In the early 20th century, the Postal Service launched airmail, which created subsidized air routes that led to our the earliest funding of our air travel network. Also in the early 20th century, rural free delivery was launched that allowed rural people to get letters delivered the same way as city residents. And then shortly thereafter, partial post was launched to deliver packages throughout the country. It was really popular. There's even some funny stories of people in small towns in the West for a while shipping their children through the post office to relatives because it was so much cheaper than buying a train ticket. And the postal carriers would accompany the children to their relatives. And they put a stop to it pretty quickly, but that's how people relied on the Postal Service throughout the country. And I would say even today, people talk about the impact of email and e-commerce. There would be no e-commerce industry if it wasn't for the post office because they deliver so many of the packages that get handed off by Amazon or UPS or FedEx and carry at the last segment, which is often a very long segment if you live in a remote rural place.
So with a mission of the post office to serve every individual residential address and business address in the country, it's a pretty large organization. Can you talk a little bit about the size and scope of the U.S. Postal Service?
Yeah, so the post office delivers 6 days a week to 160 million delivery points, businesses, apartment buildings, houses, all over the place. They have some very strange routes that go by boat and by mule, and sometimes people snowshoeing to houses in the wintertime in cold places. And they have the largest vehicle network in the country. They travel the most miles on American roads, which creates a really interesting, some really interesting revenue opportunities going forward. And they employ 500,000 workers, more than 500,000 workers. And that's particularly important for rural America. Postal workers are often the best jobs in town and very important jobs and provide stability. There's almost 8,000 postal workers in the state of Kentucky, and there's actually more postal workers than there are firefighters or carpenters or bank tellers in Kentucky. So just to give it some context, this is an important employment source.
So does the U.S. Postal Service receive funds from the federal government as part of their annual operating budget?
They don't, not since 1970 when the Postal Service was reformed and the United States Postal Service replaced the old post office, which was a federal agency. They still participate in federal functions. Their employees are in the federal retirement program. They get some very small subsidies for package deliveries to blind people, but nothing significant. And they're intended to live on their own through the amount they raise through sale of stamps and packages and other services that they offer.
And that was sort of my next question was like, how does the operation fund itself then if they are not subsidized in any way by the government?
So there's two parts to the post office. One is called universal service, and that's mandated by federal law. And there's reference to establishing a post office in the Constitution that gives Congress the authority over the post office. So the essential service, universal service requires packages to be first-class mail to be delivered at the same price to every address in America. So you can send a 55-cent letter to your next door neighbor, or you can send to somebody in Northwest Alaska or Caribou, Maine, or the farthest part of Hawaii, all for the same price. When the post office was formed in the 70s, it also created an outlet for competitive services, which would be the package business. And the post office can set its own rates there, and that's become a topic of controversy of late. But they still do it via a series of zones. I believe there's 9 zones. And so, if you're shipping from zone 4 to zone 9, you'll pay the same price whether you're shipping from a city to a city or a remote rural area to a remote rural area. And that's really important because UPS and FedEx both have established surcharges to lots of parts of America that aren't in urban areas or suburbs. We did a study last year that found that 70 million Americans are subject to surcharges for their deliveries from UPS and FedEx. And that certainly would impact postal rates similarly if the post office went out of business or faced severe financial trouble, which is forecasted.
And so speaking of the financial troubles the post office is in, how did the Postal Service find itself in this position of potential financial collapse?
So there's 2 issues really. Some of you listeners probably hear regularly every quarter or several times a year that the post office is losing billions of dollars. That is true in a financial accounting sense, and that largely stems from a law that Congress adopted in 2006 called the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act. And part of that bill was to require the post office to set up financial reserves for its employees' health care 50 years into the future. No other federal agency, no other private corporation has a mandate anything like that. And it put the post office immediately into a huge financial hole. They're actually having to set aside healthcare money for employees they'll hire decades from now who haven't even been born yet. So it's really very out of line, and it's put extraordinary pressure on the post office. If you took the cost of that requirement out of the post office's accountings, in 6 out of the last 7 years, the post office would have turned a profit. Last year, they didn't. Really, like an overwhelming amount of the losses since 2006, something like 70%, have been due to this post-retirement healthcare mandate that Congress passed, which could be eliminated just by an act of Congress. So that's one financial fix. The immediate challenges faced by the post office are not related to that 2006 act. They're related to the COVID virus. And like other businesses, the post office has seen demand for its services fall dramatically. For the first quarter, they were off in the order of 30% of mail volumes, especially marketing mail, so-called junk mail, and first-class mail. Packages were up a little bit as people started shifting and shopping from home. Package rates have gone up they've been on an upward trend for the last several quarters, which is a good thing, but it's not enough to offset the losses. So the post office, and that only had a couple weeks, in the first quarter only had a couple weeks of late March affected by COVID. The post office in the first quarter delivered 600 million fewer pieces of mail than they did in the first quarter of 2019. So that gives you a sense of the magnitude, even for a very short period. So this quarter, which we won't know about for a couple months, is expected to be far worse. Some people are saying up to 50% loss of volume. Post office can't just cut flights like an airline or ground their cruise ships like the cruise industry. They have a mandate to deliver every day to 160 million addresses. So their costs are largely unchanged, despite the shrinkage of revenue. So the Postmaster General asked Congress for $86 billion of federal assistance. The first CARES Act, which passed in late March, which was the $2 trillion act that granted Americans $1,200 a person as in personal family relief. Originally had $25 billion of federal aid for the post office in it. And President Trump, it's reported, personally insisted that be removed, and it was. So that was taken out of the first CARES Act, and in its place was offered, the post office was offered a $10 billion loan, but it had lots of strings attached that would give the executive branch, the Trump administration, the ability to change prices and change deliveries and close post offices and things like that. Kind of a poison pill that made that loan, even though that loan was far from large enough to settle the problem, it made it pretty much impossible for the postal governors to accept. So the real need right now, and they're in the new act that has passed the House and is awaiting action in the Senate, that $25 billion is back in there for postal relief. And the $10 billion loan remains as well, with the provision that the Treasury Department can't attach any strings. They just have to make the loan if the post office wants it. So there's $35 billion that will go a long way towards the more than $80 billion that the post office thinks it needs to keeping the post office solvent.
And we've heard some people suggests that the post office simply needs to charge more money for its package delivery. They could solve their problems that way. Could you speak to that idea, and is it a valid idea?
So that 2006 Act I referred to a minute ago also has provisions that the post office is not allowed to cross-subsidize. They're not allowed to do things in their competitive or in their universal business that would help the package business. So the package business really has to stand on its own, has to compete against UPS and FedEx and Amazon. It also says that they can't lose money on competitive businesses. So there's large sets of postal auditors that every year look over all of their accounting, which is very complicated, and have concluded time and again that the package business is in fact profitable. And so they're not losing money on every package. And it's also been reviewed by the courts that have found the same thing. So the president's assertion that the post office loses money on every package is not true. Fact checkers have checked it and found that it's not true from large reputable newspapers. The post office itself and its accounting breaks down the operating profits on various lines of business. And the package business is in fact far more profitable than the first class mail business. And if they were to follow President Trump's idea of raising their package rates fourfold, it would have a very bad effect on rural America, who would be paying huge amounts to receive any sort of package mail, including prescription drugs and other things that rural residents rely much more heavily on. It would surely cause Amazon to build out its network more and ship less packages through the post office, and UPS and FedEx as well. I mean, you'd see probably them still dropping mail at post offices for really remote places, but things that are, rural areas just outside the suburbs, it's almost unfathomable that UPS and FedEx and Amazon wouldn't extend their networks into those medium densely populated areas and just leave the post office with a really expensive mail to deliver.
And so with the Postmaster General saying that financial collapse is really possible, the impact to rural America, sort of the Channel 6 service area, what would the impact be? What have your studies found about that?
Well, I think a number of things should be assumed to happen immediately as they go into emergency mode, and that would be closing post offices that are not utilized that much, and those would be the ones in remote areas and rural areas. I live in Maine now, in a, I would say, suburban part of Maine. It's not it's somewhat rural, but there's a lot of people that live here. And all around are little post offices that are staffed by one postal service worker. They close for lunch hour. Some of them are only open for 2 or 3 hours in the morning or the afternoon, and then that person goes to service another post office. But they're lifelines for local communities. Some people in very rural areas would have to drive a couple of hours to get to a drop-off point for UPS or FedEx, and that's just not practical. It's impossible for small businesses to operate in towns like that. So the other thing would be, I'm pretty sure we'd see an end to 6-day delivery. We'd be down to 5 days. And then package rates could not be based on zones, but be based on cost of delivery, which again would very negatively impact people in rural and remote communities.
And we've heard some talk about the idea that the Postal Service should be privatized. What would that look like? What would that mean?
So this is a very old idea. This didn't start with President Trump, and it's been going on for decades through Republican administrations and Democratic ones. Companies like FedEx and UPS would love to have the right to deliver in the very profitable areas in cities and suburbs. They're not interested in buying the whole kit and caboodle in rural America. There's other companies like Pitney Bowes, which you may have heard of, that does the mail sorting and this little inked on stamps that you see on your business mail sometimes. They would be interested in operating the big sorting plants. They've actually provided some of the machinery that goes in those plants. So there's very profitable pieces of the postal network, the postal network that we've all built as Americans, as first as taxpayers and now as customers. So it belongs to us, and in corporate America, some of the big companies would really recognize its value and want to operate that. It would mean probably that they would change union contracts. The postal jobs would become less good jobs and more head towards being lower paying jobs that would negatively impact communities, less prosperous people living there. And there's a whole mailing industry that's several times the post office in magnitude and economic impact that could be negatively affected. And people in the mailing industry are not in favor of privatization. Other countries have tried it, Britain in particular, and they found big service declines and big price increases. They have had to unravel some of the privatization that they did decades ago. So it's not a good scene, particularly for rural America. It's not a good deal for taxpayers or the post office. The post office will be, you think the losses the post office is reporting now, if they're left with delivering to the highest cost places in the country and having a universal obligation to do that, their losses will soar. So we'll see a post office with, huge amounts of losses, and the public with far less services. The corporations that have bought those services making a bundle of money.
What do we know about how Americans across the country feel about the Postal Service and the need for financial support? Are people behind that or not?
It's actually one of the most unifying institutions that America has, and that's been true for years. Every year, there's surveys done of the government agency's popularity, and the post office has been number one for a very long time. And that continues today. At the end of April 30th, a nationwide poll was released that asked people about this question of whether there's support for federal relief, federal aid for the Postal Service related to COVID-19. 92% of Americans, including 90% of Republicans, said they supported Congress taking action to provide relief to the United States Postal Service. They asked a second question about whether people supported a loan or direct aid, a bailout. And that answer was 78% of those supported a bailout versus a loan. And the third question they asked was, should rates on packages be raised or a bailout? And the answer there was 70% favored a bailout over 30% raising package rates. So there's not many things that those kinds of numbers of Americans would agree on. So the bill in Congress, it's really important to get it moving in the Senate. There's been a lot of political pressure not to even consider it, not necessarily because there's opposition to the postal piece, but the postal piece is kind of being held hostage to the rest of this stuff.
So if our viewers were concerned about the loss of the Postal Service or its potential increases in rates, what would you advise people do who are concerned about this?
So the biggest thing you can do is to probably two things. One, talk to your neighbors, talk to your co-workers, people at church, people in your union, people other places you associate about this to make sure everyone's aware of it. And then the biggest thing you all can do together is to contact your Senator McConnell and Senator Rand Paul, and ask them to support postal relief, not just the loan, but the direct aid package that is in the bill that got sent over from the House. And it's very urgent. It's not like post office talks about running out of money in the September time period is the best forecast right now. They're not going to wait till September to start cutting this stuff if it looks like no aid is coming. So it's not something that can be delayed and deferred through the summer and wait for the next aid package or the aid package after that in order to assure continuity of service. And I think the post office is even more important during this period where people can't go to the store and get their drugs. So a quarter of Americans already get their prescriptions through the mail, and more so even now that it's hard to get to pharmacies. Other things, vote by mail, a lot of states are looking at. That's really important to have in place for September. So lots of reasons that this is exactly the wrong time to either let the post office go through a financial crisis or to start selling pieces of it off. The immediate aid needs to be dealt with now, and we can deal with the 2006 problems with the 2006 law after we get through this period.
I wondered if there are any other issues that we haven't covered about this topic that we should make sure our viewers are aware of.
Well, just briefly, the post office has suffered declines in first-class mail because of email and other things. The post office has always been an innovator. I talked earlier about airmail and parcel post and rural free delivery, and there's innovation to be had for our time. And two of the big ones are postal banking, which would allow the post office to set up additional services. They already issue money orders, as most people know. But up until the 60s, the post office was the largest holder of American savings. They had savings accounts that paid small interest rates by today's standards, but higher than banks paid. And most Americans, especially those in small towns, kept their savings, their little pot of savings at the post office. We all have heard stories about the stimulus checks having a hard time getting out. Well, the Federal Reserve has the capacity and is interested in every American having a Fed account, which would be a way that the federal government can easily transfer money to citizens to get it quickly. And rather than dealing with all these direct deposits and checks, and now they're talking about sending debit cards to people with their $1,200, it could simply have been done in one fell swoop to the Federal Reserve accounts set up for each American, and you could have gone to the post office and got your $1,200. And that would have made it much more simple. The money would have gotten out much more quickly and securely. The other piece I mentioned earlier is the post office has the most vehicles of any company in America, traveling the most miles on American roads. So there's all kinds of things that those vehicles could be used for: reporting potholes, broken street lights, water leakage, natural gas leakages in places, even sampling things like air quality for pollution measures or climate data, things like that. And those vehicles are already there. They need to invest a little money to put the sensors and things inside, but they're not having to hire whole streams of new workers to do something. It's just leveraging the amazing network that the post office has built that we've all paid for.
It's really fascinating. Great new ideas. Well, thank you, Scott, so much for sharing this important story with viewers of Channel 6. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jeff, and I wish the best for all of you viewers, and especially that they stay safe and that their postal service stays safe.
This has been Jeff Rogers for Channel 6 Central Kentucky Television. Thank you so much for joining us.